Welcome to the Bywords Show. I'm your host, Hannah Hughes. Bywords is all about equipping women for purposeful living by starting conversations, celebrating stories, and inspiring faith. In a world that applauds the hustle, I'm here to help you break free from the lies and come back to what really matters. It's time to get real, get rooted in truth, and come alive in relationship with Jesus so you can show up to each day with intention and confidence no matter where you're at in your story. Here we believe that embracing our stories brings hope, healing, and purpose to the process, and sharing our stories helps others do the same. Whether you're looking for a midweek faith refresh, practical tools for pursuing your dreams, or just need some good old-fashioned girl talk, you're in the right place. Grab your latte and let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Bywords Show. Today is the day. I'm so glad you're here. You guys, we're in for a treat. We've got Sarah Westfall with us, fellow author, podcaster, who's just released a new book. Congratulations. And today we're going to be talking about it and the topic of belonging. So I am so excited to hear your story, Sarah, and to get into this conversation. But before we get started, I have to ask you our icebreaker question. And I know you actually just told me, but for those who don't know yet, what is filling your cup lately, both literally and figuratively?
Yes, well, literally, it is this orange vanilla seltzer water. I don't know if you can see it. It
I
tastes
love
like,
that one.
yeah, it tastes like the push pops, that as a kid, at
Yes.
least I had as a kid. So it tastes like summer to me.
I love that.
Yeah. And I guess figuratively, walks, like evening walks, listening to an audiobook has been very life-giving to me as of late.
That is so nice. I love that. I have been listening to audiobooks a lot lately. I don't know if it's just the season of motherhood I'm in or just the craziness. Like, it feels like I can never get still enough to sit down and really relish a physical book like I would love to. But I am with you on the audiobook and walk game. Like, that is so nice. So I love that. And also sparkling water. I feel like definitely in the summer, there's nothing better than a crispy, cold, sparkling beverage that is so refreshing.
Yeah, it's like you need to like up the game with the regular water. I just need something a little fancier, something a little bit, I don't know, that feels splurgy or something.
Exactly. There's like some sort of science to it, I swear. Like, there has to be some sort of science to either drinking a fancy drink, even if it's just a sparkling water, or drinking it in a fancy cup. I immediately feel like at least 50% more satisfied and happy about it.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
I love it. Well, let's get into this because I am just so excited to hear about this new book. Congratulations. Would you just tell us about your book and then also your story? Like, what led you to this point, becoming passionate about this idea of belonging? And I mean, I don't know, just take us on the journey, unpack the whole thing for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me. The book is called The Way of Belonging, Reimagining Who We Are and How We Relate. And essentially, the book is just kind of taking a step back from what I know many of us think of first when we think of belonging, and that is oftentimes a little bit more like acceptance. Like we want to be wanted, we want to be invited in. But for a really long time, for me, that didn't work. that definition, that I always felt like I was on the outside of something or out of place, or that something within me I was fundamentally lacking. So part of this book is reframing belonging from something to attain or a place to achieve, like to get to that inner circle, to an invitation from God to someone that we can become, both by embracing the rich and abundant love of God and then extending that same welcome just in the midst of our very normal everyday lives. The book, my gosh, sometimes people ask, like, what's the origin story of this particular book? And I feel like on some level, I've been living it since I was really little. Belonging has kind of always been a question that's been in the back of my mind, if not at the forefront of my relationships. And I'm a firstborn, kind of come from a high achieving family. So for a really long time, I thought that belonging was something that I could achieve, that it came through recognition or honor or being in this place where I was visible. But the thing with being visible is that the spotlight is only temporary. And
Mm.
sooner or later, it kind of disappears. And so I always felt like my belonging was just out of reach. And so I've been on a long journey with this, but really what kind of brought this book in particular into life was the several years ago, almost 13 years ago, 14 years ago now, I out of desperation had to shift my approach to relationships from one where I was like insanely independent to I was in a place because we had a really we lost our son, and so I was in a place of not. I just there were so many things I couldn't do for myself. I was really in survival mode, just each breath, each day, reliant on the people around me, and in the midst of that, though, learned what it was like to not be quite so independent and to be loved both by God and other people at the very like end of myself.
Mm.
And that really began a shift in me of saying, so if belonging isn't something to attain, if it's not something to achieve, then what is it? And so, through the course of working with students on college campuses, of being a director of community for some different creative spaces, continue to pursue this question. And out of that, what I found is that so much of our belonging is rooted in our identity and in where we find meaning. And so for me, I realized that belonging, yes, does have to do with how you and I relate to one another, but there's also two other pieces of the puzzle. It's also the identity piece and understanding and living into who I am. Whenever we are not living in like authentically, not living in line with how we were created, within our strengths, I think that we feel unsettled. We feel that sense of something is off within us. And so it affects our sense of belonging. And then ultimately also the way that we connect with God himself and find our identity and our worth within him, within his love. And so the piece of whether or not people welcome me, I can't control that. I can't decide, who is going to let me in or who is going to invite me in. But what I don't want to say control over, but I can have agency over. What I can carry with me is that love of God that is with me always. And then what I extend to other people as well. And so the book really just explores that aspect, those two aspects of belonging a little bit more in depth, and then offers some shifts in posture as well as some spiritual practices for kind of going on that way of belonging and what it looks like then to have belonging not be a place of arrival, but a way of being in the world.
Wow, I love that. And I can tell just hearing your story that this has been probably a book that's just been a lifelong in the making. Like I just love those messages. It's so funny. I'm sure you can relate and maybe you've been told this as well, but like sometimes the things that we feel called to share, like our message in life is the thing that we need to learn the most. And I so relate to so much of what you're saying. And also I'm just so sorry for your loss. I have just found myself in moments as well where I'm at the end of myself and I'm like, there is absolutely nothing else I can do to make myself good enough. Like finding
Yeah.
yourself there at the end and realizing, okay, what am I striving for? And what are these standards I've even been trying to measure up to? Like, how do we define those? Because it's so interesting hearing you talk about childhood. I feel like probably everybody can relate to this in some capacity, but I feel like that belonging is one of the first things we crave. Like, once we're aware enough to realize, I want to fit in, like, I want to be like her, I want to be like my friend at school, or I want to be like, whoever we're looking up to. And we realize, if we don't fit that mold, maybe there's something wrong with me. And like, how do we figure out where we fit in this world? And so then to hear you also talking about the independent side, it's so weird how it's like this two-sided thing, because the world praises independence and it's very much like find your own way, make your own path, do your own thing, be your best self. And then on the other side of it, we are just so lonely today. Like our world is just lonely. We're craving community, we're craving connection, we want to belong somewhere, but the two just aren't working together. And so I would love to hear, like, from your experience, how did you start to figure out what belonging actually is? Like, how do we find our place, first of all, in the Lord? Like, it's not something we attain, it's something we become.
Mm. Yeah. What really shifted kind of the concept in my brain, I read Henry Nouwen's book, Return of the Prodigal Son, a few years ago now. And he talks about not only his encounter with the painting, with Rembrandt's painting, but also with just the story of the prodigal son. And in that story, he talks about, the ways that he identified with the younger son who kind of went out and had this wild living. And then he then also related to the older son who kind of tried to work to earn his worth or to prove his worth and to get that pat on the back from the father. Toward the end of the book, he says, I realized that why so often I find my identity in either one son or the other. Really, my identity and my calling, my invitation, whatever word you want to use there, is to become like the Father, to be the one who extends love, to be the one who invites others in, and who becomes that place of welcome in the world. And so for me, there's been a lot of continuing identity work that I have had to do to say, what does it look like for me to understand not only kind of some of my defaults? I tend to lean toward the older brother in that story, but then
Same.
what? Yeah. And so, but what is it to recognize some of those habits, some of those defaults, but then to realize, kind of like a lost sock, God kind of wants to turn us inside out. There's still this part of becoming, this spiritual formation that is happening as we learn to live within the love of the Father, that God doesn't want to just leave us there on the front porch. He wants to invite us in, and he wants us in the process to become more like himself. And so like that sock, the essential nature of who we are is still there, and it's good, but he is also inviting us though to live differently, to kind of change and morph, and to maybe become even more fully ourselves, in the process. And so even continuing, you said earlier, like you said something along the lines of, that this is a message that you need, or this is something to come back to. And for me, like belonging is something that shifts all the time, like that sense. It's an internal sense. So it's something that I have to keep coming back to. This is a conversation I have to revisit in order to remember, to kind of get back to that way of being, to get back to that posture. I don't know if that fully answered your question, or if I kind of went off in a completely different way. So feel free to steer us back on track. But
No, I love that, because I feel like this is so much what we wrestle with, especially as women. We start to know in our heads, like, God loves me. It's a done deal. Like, my salvation is a finished work. I'm secure in Christ. And then all of a sudden we're like running around in circles trying to figure out how to be good enough again.
yeah,
And there's just so many lies like that, or traps that I see women facing, or at least me. I've experienced so many times when I felt like, what do I have to do to be good enough, God? Like, what do I have to do to earn your love, or to earn this place in the world, or be worthy of my calling? All of those things that I just feel this pressure. I put it on myself, or I hear from the world or social media or whatever that looks like. But maybe in your own experience, or what you've seen in other women, like, what do you think are some of the biggest lies that we believe, or things that we get caught up in that confuse us about this true idea of belonging?
yeah. There's a lot, I think, that's working against us. I mean, there's some of the cultural things, like you mentioned earlier, in terms of independence, or that mentality of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, um, and not letting weakness be welcomed in yourself or other people. I think one of the one of the biggest detriments that we have sometimes to our belonging is that we don't hold the tension and hold the truth that at the same time we are both weak and worthy.
Mm.
And so what that means is that we are both made in the image of God. We are that divine essence has been in each of us from the beginning. And so there is worth there built in. That welcome is within us. We are also broken. We are imperfect. We are not God.
Right.
and and by hiding over those weaknesses, so often they are just left to fester, or we end up hiding parts of who we are in attempt to be better liked. And really in the end, that is just hindering intimacy. It's hindering our ability to relate with the fuller version of ourselves, both between us and God, but also between us and each other. I also just think sometimes our pace of life is really hurting us to some degree. I think that there's always this pull in our culture toward more, whether that is more things, more calendar items, more whatever, you fill in the blank. And what being spread thin doesn't allow is depth. And so we crave this depth of connection, but our pace of life doesn't always support it. And
Yeah.
so I think it might look different for each of us, but I think it's definitely something to consider, that if what we want is deeper relationships, more connection with one another, what is our pace of life? Or do we need to focus on fewer relationships in order to go deeper? Those are just a few things. I think too, we're in a cultural moment where we have lost the art of learning to love well amidst disagreement.
Yes.
And so, one of my personal desires, one of my personal hopes is that we can continue to move closer to one another with a posture of curiosity and seeking to understand. And whether or not we're not trying to like necessarily bring anyone to our point of view, but helping us try to step into the experiences of another person, if anything, to grow in compassion and grow in empathy, so that we remain soft hearted toward one another. And so I think that our culture and myself are not doing very well at that right now. And so my hope would be that we would, I don't know, learn to disagree well again.
I love that. And I feel the same way so strongly. I just have seen how, even in this idea of belonging, like so many believers are fighting to be right, like to find the right fit, have the right opinion, win the argument, whatever, like know everything there is to know and be right. And so much of the time, all that does is just put walls up and cause more division. It doesn't help anybody. It makes us feel further from where we actually want to be, in that place of just feeling like settled and belonging, that kind of thing. And it's so beautiful. Earlier, you were talking about how really it's kind of a coming back to ourselves, and that idea that, this was God's design for us all along. And sometimes it just takes a little winding road to figure out, like, oh, this is what he really meant for me. So, as you've gone through this journey, and again, belonging is not something to attain, but someone to become, can you elaborate on that concept of how adopting that posture of welcome can transform not only our relationships, but like you said, our sense of self, our relationship with God, all of that?
Yeah. I think so often when we think of belonging as like holding our hands out and wishing somebody would like put it in our hands, or that's something that they're going to give us that acceptance, or to say, hey, you fit in here. So often that can create additional wounds and can create additional loneliness and separation. And I have the tendency in those moments to start turning inward and to kind of cave in on myself,
Yeah.
essentially, and to pull back from even some of my closest relationships. But when I see belonging as a way of being, when I get ready to walk into a room, whether it's full of strangers or full of people I know, a room full of people, I'm an introvert. And so I always get a little like, sweaty in the process. But if I can pause before going into that room and say, that welcome of God is already with me, that the presence of God is already with me. I am already loved right where I am. And that is mine to then extend as I walk into the room. I bring that in with me. And so to have eyes that are looking outward, not to be everybody's best friend, not to be everybody's answer to their own loneliness, but to have eyes to see the humanity of another person, to listen to their story, to understand their ache, to understand their joys, and see them for the worth and the welcome that they bring in the room as well. That turning outward actually increases my sense of belonging, and I think other people's sense of belonging so much more than when those arrows start turning inward and we just start caving in on ourselves and we're flooded with thoughts of, what did they think, or how, what did they think about me, and all the stories we can tend to tell about ourselves. And I read a book in preparation for my book it was called Belonging, but it's by a Stanford professor and researcher. And he pulled from a study that was done that there was actually an increased sense of belonging in circumstances where that person was offering it versus when they were on the receiving side of it. And so science also seems to indicate that there is something that happens within our humanity, in our sense of belonging, that increases it when we give, when we extend that welcome that we want when we walk into a room. And so it's, it's strange and sometimes it's counterintuitive when we are nervous, but it does change the way that we enter a room.
That is really cool and so fascinating that even the science shows it really does switch the whole situation around whenever we, instead of focusing on ourselves, can focus on others. Because I don't know about you, but there were so many years of my life, teens into early 20s, like college days, where I was so overly worried and aware of how others were perceiving me that I felt insecure all the time. I was always worried what people were thinking of me, and I always felt like I had to prove myself or strive to be this person. Like you talked about achievement in the beginning, and I just relate to that so much. I just felt like it was always something that I needed to earn or be or perform or achieve. And how crazy is it that sometimes the answers we're looking for happen when we get outside of ourselves and start actually focusing on other people, and how much that can even change our hearts. You know how crazy it is, whenever people talk about how when you're in need, serve others. I don't know if y'all have ever done that or experienced that, but it just fills your heart and brings joy and peace like absolutely nothing else can. So that's so wild to think about in relationships, but it makes so much sense. And especially when you're talking about finding that place of belonging where we fit with God, and then being able to extend that to others. What does that look like? How does it change our relationship with God? And then how do we get to the place of, in a healthy way, extending that to other people? What does that look like practically?
Yeah. Belonging, and I'll say this over and over and over until it gets down into my own soul, if not somebody else's, is that belonging, we don't arrive. My mom is however many years older than I am. And we talked not long ago, and she was talking about how this season of life, it's shifting again. She's wondering, who are my people and where do I belong? And what is, a lot of worth and purpose and these questions. I think it does shift. And when it shifts, I think that we can ask ourselves, what we can sit with some questions. And one of the first questions Jesus asked in the book of John was what are you looking for? And so being able to sit with that question, what are you looking for? What do you want? What is the ache? Beginning to wrap words around what it is that we want, what it is that we desire when it comes to our connections, when it comes to our relationships with God or with other people, and being able to then kind of go beneath the layers in those things and to name what that is, and to kind of to confess, to say it out loud to God, and to trust Him with those tender pieces of our hearts and of our desires. Because sometimes that's really hard for me. It's really hard to like get down to the root of the thing and then say, okay, God, like, here it is. Even though he, obviously he was
Right.
already there. He already knew. But for whatever reason, I can get really white knuckled about it. And so continuing to come back to that place of being able to name the longing, name the desire, and to say that out loud to God, and then maybe to a few other people, eventually, like maybe for me, and maybe it's my husband and my closest friend or two. And sometimes it's just for me and God too. I think it's okay to hold something sacred, but I think just that practice of reflection and noticing and naming becomes really important to understanding what is happening in the landscape of our souls, and then being able to talk to God about it and to recognize it and to know that He is there with us in it. One thing that I feel like God has to say to me over and over again, especially when it comes to my belonging, is like, you do not have to try so hard. I love you in just being. I love you in the nothingness. When you are doing nothing and you haven't showered and there's dirty dishes piled mile high in our sink, like, you are loved just as you are. And so coming back to that and reminding myself of that, of letting God speak that invitation into the midst of my everyday life. And then when I find myself being settled in that, it makes me much more settled in how I relate to other people, because I'm not looking anymore for affirmation. I'm not looking necessarily for that pat on the back or that recognition, because there's a settledness that is deeper within myself that I carry with me, that sense of welcome that is already there. And then it frees me then to extend that to other people. But it is a process of, like, I can get really twisty and cave in on myself really quickly. And then it's coming back to that, getting back to that posture, getting back to that way of being, and then letting it change how I relate even to my kids in my home. And it softens me. It makes me a little bit, and we're in the middle of summer and I get like, it's so loud here. And that can, like, I can feel that in my skin by like the end of the day, just the volume. They're not being bad, they're just being loud. But it definitely changes my responses. Sometimes I can be very sharp. So it's something that I have to continue to come back to and let myself find some quiet and be settled and name the thing and say it out loud, kind of rinse and repeat all over again and again.
Yeah. That's so good. And I'm so glad you brought up the identity piece again as well, because I do feel like that's such a huge piece of it that maybe gets overlooked a lot when we talk about belonging, because it's like, oh, well, I just want to find my people. I just want to find my place in life. I just want to find, like, my place with God. What am I called to do? And all of those things. And wow, like, how powerful to feel settled in your identity. I mean, that alone changes how you relate to everyone. Like, when you know who you are and you're not just waiting for someone else to tell you or looking for that information, or weighing how good you are or how you're doing or who you are by the opinions of others, like, that is a never ending road, just waiting for other people to affirm what you hope is true about you, or those kinds of things. So the identity piece is huge and foundational, I feel like. So for you, like, if you were talking to somebody who they're like, okay, I just don't know where to begin, like, how do I get this identity piece figured out? What would you say?
Oh, there are so many practical tools out there in terms of being able to really discover who we are. And yes, there's like the knowledge of that we are made in the image of God and that we are loved. But I think that really understanding who we are and how we are wired sometimes takes a lifetime. Like, I'm continuing here in my 40s to understand the things that deplete me, to understand the things that I'm really gifted to do or that are mine to do. and then the things that I can say no to. And so I think building in habits of reflection, building in habits of, again, noticing and naming are really important in being able to ask ourselves, like, what really is happening beneath the surface here? Some tools that have been helpful to me and to my husband, just to give us some language to understand how different people experience the world and how I experience the world, has been the Enneagram. And I know there have been, there's wide opinions on the Enneagram, and it's not a replacement for anything else, but I think that it has been a helpful tool for us to understand ourselves a little bit better, to understand what motivates us, what often paralyzes us, how we approach any given situation. So that's been helpful. At different times, therapy has been helpful. And seeing a spiritual, or sitting with a spiritual director, has been helpful. And two, I mean, maybe sometimes this is really vulnerable and hard, but I think that if we have trusted people in our lives, that we can ask them questions of like how they perceive us, or how just to help us to better understand the outside observations, not to let it define us necessarily, but to invite other people into that process of really understanding who we are and how we are wired over the long haul. And what a gift to be able to ask those questions and have people answer them and like stay in the room and not walk away. And two, I would think the work of Dr. Kurt Thompson has been really important to me as well. He does a lot of work in the area of like being known. I think he has a podcast even called that, or something similar to that. And so a lot of the neuroscience and attachment theory. And so that goes into understanding who we are and then how we relate to the world as we go through it, has been really helpful as well.
That's so good. And it is vulnerable, like you said, inviting people in, even inviting the Lord in, but having someone, whether it's the Holy Spirit, someone you love and trust, or a therapist, even like y'all already know how I feel about therapy. Like, yes and amen. But having those people to help you see your blind spots, like loving you through the healing of that, loving you through the process of that. There's nothing better than having somebody in your corner who can sit with you in the hard stuff, at the uncomfortable stuff. Like, that to me says belonging so much. Like, even just sitting with the Lord and, like you said, reflection and getting still and letting him lovingly bring the pieces together for you that maybe we can't see on our own. Because I don't know about y'all, but I just get in my head so much. And my view of myself is pretty, one-sided, obviously, but just feels so like I just perceive myself one way. And sometimes it's really hard to change that when you have this one idea of who you are and how you show up in the world. It can be really uncomfortable to ask for feedback on that, but it is really so healthy and helpful to allow God and other people into that process. I would love to know as well, like, you mentioned some of the practical things in your book, practices for this belonging. Is there anything else that you would love women to have in their tool belt as far as this practice of welcome and belonging and extending that to others?
Depending upon I'm a big reader, so I think the first thing that comes to mind is a list of books, but and I just really want to like emphasize, like, my book is one book out of so many books on this topic of belonging. This is one perspective on a much wider conversation. And so I think it's good to kind of read widely. Brene Brown has some really great resources and research that she has done around the topic of belonging and vulnerability. I have a couple friends who just this year released books. One is called Ethnic Loneliness, or no, Beyond Ethnic Loneliness. So talking a little bit about how marginalization has affected the isolation and sense of belonging. Another friend of mine wrote a book that came out actually yesterday as of this recording, called Othered, by Janai Amen, and talking about how sometimes spiritual abuse and marginalization affects our sense of belonging and what it looks like then to find that belonging within the God who sees, knows, and loves us. I would also say I'd love for you to come over to my podcast, Human Together, because we we continue to talk about these conversations on the communal life, all aspects of it. One practice that I like to do on occasion, sometimes seasonally, just because this does bend and shift, is sometimes sitting with like who are the people God is inviting me to go deeper with in this season. Naturally, God wants me to take care of my kids and to continue to nurture my marriage and to, give my husband some time and attention. But beyond that, what are some of the names? Who are some of the people that God might be inviting me to press into a little bit more in this season? And so inviting God into that question, and maybe sometimes I like to journal through that, and allowing ourselves to kind of ask it again, either, quarterly or twice a year, because the thing that I've learned about belonging is that we have to allow for people to change. For, sometimes we move and places change, or places that once felt like they fit no longer do. And being able to allow that to bend and flex then lets our sense of belonging remain a little bit more settled when we expect that people and places are going to change.
That's
and
so
then
good.
We can ask that question of who is it that, we might want to move a little bit closer to in this season, and just seeing what God does with it, just treating it like we're putting seeds out into the soil, and we're going to see whether anything sprouts up and grows. We're going to cultivate it the best we can, but also recognizing it might not, and that's okay too.
Yeah, that's really, really good. And kind of circling back to what you said earlier about just being curious, approaching life and relationships from a place of openness and curiosity and invitation and welcome. Man, I mean, that's so backwards from what I feel like so many people have either experienced or what they've been told is, quote, the right way to do it, or, what's been modeled for us. But how beautiful, even remembering what you were saying about the prodigal son, like taking the posture and the position of the father who's just open. That's such a freeing way to live. And I feel like when we are able to get our identity settled in the Lord and then remain open and welcoming for other people, what a cool way to live. That's so beautiful. And I'm sure you've just seen how it's shifted for you and your relationships as well. Like just being willing to take that posture rather than like always being on guard or like always hoping to perform or, put on your best face and be accepted, like not working for that affirmation or striving for acceptance. But how have you seen it's changed your relationships when you're able to take that position from a place of knowing I already belong, I'm already secure?
Yeah. Even within my most intimate relationships, like I think of my marriage, my husband Ben, even in the context of that relationship, we go through different seasons, and sometimes things are really easy and clicking, and sometimes they're not. When I can embrace this posture, and when I find myself being settled in the embrace of the Father, and paying attention to his invitation to become more like him, I am much less prone to fear. I'm much less prone into like self-protection and grasping for what is mine, and much more able then to give from a place of genuine love and affection. Ben and I have been on quite a journey. That there was a very long season. We've almost been married 20 years now. And there was a very long season where there was just like a little part of me that I always felt like I had to keep protected, just in case he turned out to be someone other than who I thought he was. And he gave me no reason to think that. This is stemming from wounds from other people from the past. But in that kind of self-protection and keeping a little bit for myself, it still remained kind of a barrier between us. It remained like I wasn't able to fully love and to give or receive love from him. And so I know the difference within myself now, and what that looks like. And when I learn to love freely and to give freely, it can be scary, but it also can be incredibly freeing when I realize that it's not so bad to it's not so bad to just kind of let yourself float and to let faith carry you in a way, even though you can't see how, you can't see up the road. And so yeah, so I think that what I have found, the more that I keep practicing this, the more that I keep coming back to this posture, is that I feel like I can breathe easier in relationships. I feel there's so much more room to like inhale deep and exhale slowly. It's just been incredibly freeing to me. It's not that I don't experience loneliness. I probably do most days at some moment to some degree. But I find myself just being much less grasping for all of it and much more settled.
That is really, really good. Wow, I love that. How it's true. Like there will be hard seasons, we will still have struggles. We will still face loneliness. Places and relationships will change, and we can still be rooted in that sense of belonging. That is really, like you said, freeing. I feel that deeply. We've been in a transition, as you guys know, moving, and I just have been processing through some of those same things. Like, where do I fit in this as well? And
Yeah.
instead of trying to find our place with people or position or location, even really coming back to the truth of who we are in Christ and then being able to extend that to others is a really, really freeing and powerful thing. I love
Yeah.
that.
And giving yourself permission to go slowly. Like
Mm.
trust and transparency, when we give it the gift of time, like we can go gradual. And it's that's we don't live in a gradual culture. We live in a,
Right?
instant culture. But I think that there's a lot that we can gain in that gradualness and allowing ourselves to start small and go slow.
That's so good. So if there was a woman listening right now who is just wrestling with this idea of like, where do I fit? Where do I belong? I don't know how to figure this out. I'm just so tired of like trying to force my way into something or figuring out all of this. What would you say to her?
Yeah. I mean, I have been her more often than not. So first of all, you're not alone. You are not the
Mm.
only one. You know, I end the book. There's a section called A Borrowed Hope. And there have been so many seasons where I look out at the horizon and it's like, God, I just don't see it. And I'm weary from trying. I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to keep trying. I don't want to be the one who's constantly reaching out. And in those moments of weariness, in those moments when I cannot see, like, God, are you sure it's not good for man to be alone? Because it sure seems easier right now. So when I'm in those moments, I return. There's a prayer that Jesus prayed just, in the hours before he was arrested and taken away. And he prays for all believers. And in that prayer, it's in John 17. He says, may they all be one, I and him and you and they. And it kind of has this like the language, I'm not using the exact words now, but the language is very circular and it's very communal. It almost feels like a dance. There's a cadence to it as you read through the words. Sometimes I just return to that verse and I read it over and over again. And I say, okay, Jesus, I can't see it right now. All that I have is the fact that you can see it. And I'm going to borrow your hope right now. I'm going to borrow the fact that you can see that you created us to be communal, even when it hurts really bad right now, and allowing myself to borrow the hope that Jesus has, and maybe the hope that of others around me as well, that this is what we were created for. We were created to be in deep communion with God and with one another, to love God with the fullness of who we are and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so I may not feel it, I may not see it, but Jesus does. And I can let that prayer just kind of be like a blanket over me and just sit in it for a while. And it's okay to have seasons of just not trying so hard.
That's so beautiful and so, so good. Wow. I cannot wait to dive into this book. I feel like I'm probably going to be highlighting and marking every single thing. This is so good. I feel like this is such a needed conversation. And for women, especially, like we crave that so much. So thank you for your story, being faithful to the process and then being willing to give language to this for us so that we can go on the journey as well. So before we go, please tell everyone, where can we get a copy of your book? And then where can they connect with you to continue these conversations?
Yeah, thank you. The Way of Belonging, I mean, if you Google it, it'll pop up on, bookshop.org and InterVarsity Press, my publisher, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's in all those typical places. And then best ways to connect with me, I'm on Instagram at Sarah_Westfall. And then I have a newsletter that I send out a few times a month called Human Together. That's also the name of my podcast. And so if you just Google Human Together, you'll find me either on Substack or in the podcast world.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll make sure all of those are linked for you guys. Thank you again, Sarah. I just really appreciate you and just what you're doing to help women understand this really, really important truth about identity and belonging.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me into this space. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune into another episode of the By Words Show. I love having you here, and I am truly so thankful for your support. Don't forget to share a screenshot of this episode to let me know you were here, and quick favor, if you enjoyed this episode, would you take a second to leave a review? It really helps our community grow. If you want more, you can shop my books Waking Up and Love Is at thehannahhughes.com or on Amazon, and be sure to join my email list for all the latest news. I can't wait to chat again soon, but in the meantime, be sure to come connect with me on social media, and remember, I'm cheering you on.